At my husband's funeral, my son said, "Don't embarrass us. Stand in the back." I did. When the priest asked, "Who wants to say final words?" my son walked up. Then the priest said, "Wait." His wife arranged something special. The screen turned on. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. The church fell silent as every head turned toward the large screen behind the altar. My heart pounded in my chest, confusion mixing with the grief that had consumed me for the past week. I hadn't arranged anything. I stood frozen in the back row, my black dress still damp from the morning rain, watching my son Michael's face drain of color. His wife Sarah gripped his arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his suit jacket. My name is Margaret Thompson, and at 68 years old, I thought I understood my place in this world. I was the woman who spent 45 years building a life with Robert Thompson, the man lying in that polished mahogany casket at the front of the church. The woman who had given up her dreams of medical school when I got pregnant with Michael at 23. The woman who worked night shifts in the emergency room for 30 years, coming home exhausted to pack school lunches and help with homework. I was the mother who never missed a soccer game, even when it meant losing sleep between double shifts. The wife who learned to cook Robert's mother's recipes perfectly because they reminded him of home. The woman who saved every penny so our 3 children could graduate college without debt, while I wore the same winter coat for 15 years. Our neighbors knew me as the lady who brought soup when someone was sick, who babysat for free when young parents needed a break. The church volunteers called me their most reliable member, always first to sign up for the thankless tasks nobody else wanted. My daughter Emma once told her friends I was too nice for my own good, and maybe she was right. I had spent my entire adult life putting everyone else first. When Robert wanted to invest in risky business ventures, I worked extra shifts to cover our bills when they failed. When Michael needed money for his wedding to Sarah, I emptied my personal savings without hesitation. When Emma struggled with her boutique business, I co-signed loans I knew she couldn't repay. 3 days ago, when Robert's heart finally gave out after his long battle with cardiovascular disease, I thought my role was clear. I was the grieving widow, the one who would handle the arrangements, comfort our children, and somehow find a way to move forward. But that morning, as I dressed for the funeral in the bedroom I'd shared with Robert for decades, Michael had knocked on my door. "Mom," he'd said, not meeting my eyes, "Sarah and I think it would be best if you kept a low profile today. This is really hard for us, and we need to be strong for Dad's business associates and our friends. Just stand in the back, okay? Don't make a scene." The words had cut deeper than any physical wound I'd treated in my nursing career. Don't make a scene. As if my grief was something embarrassing, something to be hidden. I had nodded, too shocked to speak, and watched my son walk away without a backward glance. Now, standing in that back row where my own children had banished me, watching confusion ripple through the congregation, I realized something was happening that none of us had expected. The priest looked as bewildered as everyone else, checking his notes, whispering to the funeral director. But the screen was already flickering to life. And Robert's voice, the voice I'd fallen asleep to for 45 years, began to speak from beyond the grave. Just 6 months before Robert's death, our life had settled into the comfortable rhythm that comes with decades of marriage. Every morning at 6:30 a.m., I would slip out of bed careful not to wake Robert, padding downstairs in the same fuzzy slippers Emma had given me 5 Christmases ago. The coffee maker would gurgle to life, filling our kitchen with the rich aroma of Robert's favorite Colombian dark roast. He liked it strong with just a splash of cream, no sugar. After 45 years, I could prepare it with my eyes closed. Our kitchen was my favorite room in the house, with its butter-yellow walls covered in family photographs spanning 5 decades. There was Michael's first day of kindergarten, his gap-toothed grin bright beneath his backwards baseball cap. Emma's college graduation, her eyes sparkling with tears of joy. Sarah and Michael's wedding photo, everyone looking so hopeful and young. Robert and me on our 40th anniversary, his arm around my shoulders as we stood in front of the restaurant where we'd had our first date. By 7:15, Robert would shuffle downstairs in his worn terry cloth robe, the navy one I'd been threatening to throw away for years. He'd kiss my forehead, mumble, "Morning, beautiful," through his sleepy haze, and settle into his chair with the newspaper. We didn't need to talk much anymore. The comfortable silence between us was filled with understanding, with thousands of mornings just like this one. Tuesdays and Thursdays, I volunteered at the church food pantry from 9 to noon. Sister Catherine always saved the heavy lifting for when I arrived, knowing my years in the emergency room had kept me stronger than most women my age. I loved sorting donations, chatting with the regular families who came for help, making sure the elderly Mrs. Patterson got the soft bread that was easier on her dentures. Robert would spend his mornings in his study, managing what remained of his consulting business. He'd officially retired 2 years ago, but a handful of loyal clients still sought his advice. I'd bring him lunch at exactly 12:30, usually a sandwich and soup, eating together while he told me about market trends I pretended to understand. His eyes would light up when he explained a particularly clever investment strategy, and I'd nod along, just happy to see him passionate about something. Afternoons were for errands and housework, grocery shopping on Mondays, laundry on Wednesdays, cleaning on Fridays. I kept our home running like clockwork, the same way I'd once managed emergency room schedules. Everything had its place, its time, its purpose. The predictability was soothing after years of chaos raising 3 children. Sunday dinners were sacred. Without fail, Michael and Sarah would arrive at 4 p.m., Emma trailing in around 4:30 with apologies about traffic. I'd spend the entire day cooking: pot roast with carrots and potatoes, homemade rolls, green beans with almonds, and always a pie for dessert. Apple in the fall, cherry in summer, pecan during the holidays. The dining room would fill with conversation and laughter, the sound of silverware against china, complaints about work and updates about friends we'd known since the children were small. After dinner, Robert and Michael would retreat to the living room to watch whatever sport was in season while Sarah helped me clear the table, though her help often felt more like supervision. Emma would sit at the kitchen island, scrolling through her phone, occasionally sharing gossip about people I'd never met. These evenings weren't perfect, but they were ours. They were family. At night, Robert and I would lie in bed discussing our plans for retirement. The trip to Italy we'd been promising ourselves since our honeymoon. Maybe a cruise to Alaska. Definitely more time with the grandchildren Michael and Sarah kept saying they'd have soon. We'd fall asleep holding hands, his fingers intertwined with mine, assuming we had all the time in the world to make these dreams reality. How wrong we were about everything. The first crack in my peaceful world appeared on a Thursday evening in early March, exactly 3 months before Robert's death. I had just returned from grocery shopping, struggling with heavy bags because Michael had canceled our usual weekly lunch where he'd help me with errands. "Something came up at work," he'd said, his voice oddly strained over the phone. As I unpacked groceries in the kitchen, I heard Michael's voice drifting from Robert's study. That wasn't unusual. Michael often stopped by to discuss investments with his father. But something about his tone made me pause, my hand frozen on a can of green beans. It was urgent, almost desperate, unlike his usual casual business conversations with Robert. "She doesn't need to know about this, Dad. It would just worry her unnecessarily," Michael was saying. I moved closer to the doorway, my heart beginning to race. Through the crack, I could see Michael leaning over Robert's desk, pointing at something on the computer screen. Robert was nodding slowly, his reading glasses perched on his nose, looking troubled. "Your mother has always handled our finances together with me, son." "This feels wrong," Robert said, his voice uncertain in a way I'd rarely heard. "Times have changed, Dad. You need to protect your assets. Mom's getting older, and let's be honest, she's never really understood the complexities of modern financial planning. Sarah's brother is an expert in elder law. He says this is standard procedure now." The conversation stopped abruptly when I accidentally knocked over the umbrella stand in the hallway. Michael emerged from the study seconds later, his face flushed, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, hi, Mom. Didn't know you were home. I was just leaving." He kissed my cheek quickly and practically ran out the door, leaving me standing there with a growing sense of unease. That weekend, Sarah called with an unusual request. "Margaret, I'd love to help you organize your important documents. You know, insurance policies, bank statements, investment portfolios. My friend just went through a nightmare when her mother passed because nothing was properly filed." Her voice was honey-sweet, but something felt off. Sarah had never shown any interest in helping me with anything before, always too busy with her yoga classes and book club meetings. "That's thoughtful, dear, but everything's already well organized," I told her. "Are you sure? Michael mentioned you've been a bit forgetful lately. Misplacing things?" Sarah pressed. I felt my stomach drop. Forgetful? I hadn't misplaced anything. My mind was as sharp as it had been when I was managing emergency room triage. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," I said carefully. The following week, I noticed Robert spending unusual amounts of time in his study with the door locked. When I'd knock to bring him coffee or lunch, he'd quickly close his laptop screen, shuffling papers to cover whatever he'd been reading. "Just boring financial stuff, dear. Nothing to concern yourself with," he'd say. But his smile was strained, and he couldn't quite meet my eyes. One evening, I found him on the phone in our bedroom, speaking in hushed tones. "Yes, I understand the implications. No, she doesn't know yet. I need more time to think about this." When he saw me in the doorway, he ended the call immediately. "Wrong number," he said, though I'd clearly heard an entire conversation. Small things kept adding up. Michael and Sarah whispering at Sunday dinner, going quiet when I entered the room. Emma suddenly asking detailed questions about our retirement savings, something she'd never cared about before. Robert's sudden interest in taking walks alone, claiming he needed thinking time. The way all three of them would exchange glances when they thought I wasn't looking. I told myself I was imagining things. This was my family, the people I'd devoted my entire life to nurturing and protecting. Surely they wouldn't be plotting something behind my back. But the cold feeling in my chest continued to grow. I spent the next 2 weeks constructing elaborate explanations for everything I'd witnessed. Lying in bed at night, staring at the ceiling while Robert snored beside me, I'd rationalize every suspicious moment until it seemed harmless. They were planning something nice for me. That had to be it. Our 45th wedding anniversary was coming up in 6 months. Perhaps this was all about a surprise party or a special gift that required financial planning. "You're being paranoid, Margaret," I whispered to myself while folding laundry, finding comfort in the familiar routine. The warm smell of fabric softener, the rhythmic motion of creating perfect squares from chaos. These things were real and solid, not like the shapeless fears creeping around the edges of my mind. When doubt crept in, I pushed it away with memories of better times. Michael bringing me breakfast in bed on Mother's Day when he was 7, most of it spilled on the tray but made with such love. Sarah crying on my shoulder when she and Michael had their first major fight, trusting me with her fears about their marriage. Emma calling me at midnight from college, homesick and scared, just needing to hear her mother's voice. These were my people, my family. Good families don't conspire against each other. Good mothers trust their children. Good wives support their husbands' decisions. I'd repeated these mantras throughout my marriage, and they'd served me well. Why should I stop believing them now? I threw myself into domestic tasks with renewed energy, as if keeping busy could silence the whispers of suspicion. I reorganized the entire pantry, alphabetizing spices and labeling containers. I deep-cleaned carpets that didn't need cleaning, scrubbed baseboards that already gleamed. When Robert commented on my sudden burst of household enthusiasm, I laughed it off. Just feeling energetic. Maybe it's that new vitamin Sister Catherine recommended. At the grocery store, I ran into Betty Harrison, whose husband worked at the same estate planning firm as the business card I'd found in Robert's pocket. She mentioned seeing Robert there recently, and my heart nearly stopped. But I forced a smile. Oh, yes, he's updating some paperwork. You know how men are, always worrying about having everything in perfect order. Betty nodded knowingly, and I changed the subject to her new grandchild, desperate to avoid more questions. The following Sunday, when Michael and Sarah came for dinner, I watched them carefully while pretending everything was normal. I served Michael an extra large portion of pot roast, his favorite. I complimented Sarah's new handbag, even though it looked exactly like her last three. I laughed at all the right moments, asked about work, shared neighborhood gossip. I was performing the role of contented mother-in-law to perfection. "Mom, you seem tired," Michael observed, and I saw him exchange a meaningful look with Sarah. You sleeping okay?" "Never better," I lied, though I'd been awake most nights, my mind racing with possibilities I couldn't bear to fully examine. "You know, if you're feeling overwhelmed with the house and Dad's care, we could look into some help," Sarah suggested, her voice dripping with false concern. "Maybe someone to come in a few days a week? Or there are wonderful senior communities now, like resorts, really." "I'm 68, not 88, I said, keeping my tone light despite the alarm bells ringing in my head. "And your father doesn't need care. He's perfectly healthy." Robert shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearing his throat. "Actually, Margaret, my last cardiology appointment wasn't great. The doctor thinks the stress of managing everything might be affecting my heart." This was news to me. I'd been to every appointment with him for 5 years. When had he gone alone? But I swallowed my questions, nodded sympathetically, and served dessert. Apple pie with vanilla ice cream, everyone's favorite. If I just kept being the perfect wife, the perfect mother, the perfect grandmother in waiting, everything would be fine. It had to be fine. The alternative was unthinkable. The truth began to unravel on a mundane Wednesday morning, 2 weeks after that unsettling Sunday dinner. I was doing Robert's laundry, checking pockets as I always did, a habit formed from decades of finding everything from crayons to important receipts hidden in the folds of fabric. My fingers closed around a stiff piece of cardstock in his golf windbreaker, the one he'd worn last Tuesday when he claimed to be meeting his old foursome at the country club. Harrison and Associates, estate planning attorneys. The embossed letters seemed to pulse under my fingertips. Below the firm name was an appointment date and time, Tuesday, March 18th, 2 p.m., last week, when Robert had supposedly been on the golf course. My hands began to tremble as I turned the card over. There, in Robert's distinctive handwriting, were words that made my blood run cold. New will. Michael executor. Margaret minimized. Minimized. That single word hit me like a physical blow. I sank onto the laundry room floor, still clutching the business card, my mind struggling to process what this meant. After 45 years of marriage, of building everything together, of being equal partners, I was being minimized, reduced, diminished. I sat there among the scattered dirty clothes, the washing machine humming its familiar rhythm, and tried to make sense of it. The card was dated. This wasn't some preliminary consideration. Robert had actually gone to the appointment. He'd sat in a lawyer's office and discussed removing me from my own life. With shaking legs, I stood and walked to Robert's study. He was at his monthly breakfast meeting with his investment club. Wouldn't be home for at least 2 hours. I'd never snooped through his things before, never felt the need to. Trust had been the foundation of our marriage, but that trust now felt like quicksand beneath my feet. His laptop was closed, but not locked. I opened it, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. His email was still logged in. I searched for Harrison and found a thread of messages dating back 3 months. My stomach churned as I read them. "Dear Mr. Thompson, as discussed with your son Michael, we can certainly arrange for asset protection that limits your wife's access to major financial decisions. This is becoming increasingly common in situations where cognitive decline is a concern." Cognitive decline? I read on, each email more damning than the last. Michael had initiated everything, convincing Robert that I was showing early warning signs of dementia, forgetting conversations that never happened, misplacing items I'd never lost, confusion about finances I understood perfectly well. There was a PDF attachment labeled Thompson Estate Restructuring Proposal. I opened it with trembling fingers. The house I'd spent 30 years maintaining, the one I'd painted and wallpapered and turned into a home, was to be transferred to Michael's name for tax purposes. Our joint savings account, funded primarily by my nursing salary over 3 decades, would be placed in a trust with Michael as trustee. I would receive a monthly allowance, like a child receiving pocket money. The retirement account I'd built through years of night shifts and overtime would be protected under Sarah's management. Even my mother's jewelry, passed down through generations and meant for Emma eventually, was already being cataloged for proper distribution. I found another email from Sarah dated just last week. Mr. Thompson, I've researched several excellent assisted living facilities that specialize in memory care. When the time comes, and I believe it will be soon based on what Michael has observed, we'll be ready to make Margaret comfortable while protecting your assets. Assisted living, memory care. They weren't just planning to minimize me. They were planning to erase me entirely, to lock me away while they divided up everything Robert and I had built together. I printed everything, my hands moving on autopilot while my mind reeled. 45 years of marriage reduced to a business transaction. The man I'd loved since I was 23 was conspiring with our children to discard me like outdated furniture. The evidence was undeniable, printed in black and white, signed with familiar names, planning my removal with the cold efficiency of a corporate merger. Robert's heart attack came suddenly 2 weeks later, on a gray Thursday afternoon. He collapsed in his study while I was in the garden, pruning the roses he'd given me for our last anniversary. By the time I found him, called 911, and rode with him in the ambulance, he was gone. My hands were still stained with soil as I held his cooling fingers in the hospital room, whispering goodbye to the man I thought I knew. The will reading was scheduled for the Monday after the funeral. Mr. Harrison's office was all dark wood and leather, designed to impress and intimidate. Michael and Sarah arrived early, taking the 2 chairs directly in front of the lawyer's desk. Emma sat to their left, fidgeting with her phone. They'd left me the chair in the corner, slightly separated from the family group. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. "Before we begin," Mr. Harrison said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, "I need to confirm that this is indeed the most recent version of Mr. Thompson's will, executed 3 weeks ago." 3 weeks. While I'd been cooking his favorite meals and ensuring he took his heart medication on time, Robert had been signing papers to destroy my future. "The house at 427 Maple Street," Mr. Harrison read in his monotone voice, "is to be transferred to Michael Robert Thompson to protect the asset from potential medical expenses and ensure it remains in the family. My home. The place where I'd raised my children, hosted countless Christmas mornings, and planted every flower in the garden." Michael wouldn't even look at me, just nodded as if this was expected, deserved. The joint savings account and associated investments totaling approximately $500,000 are to be placed in a trust with Michael Thompson as executor and sole trustee. Margaret Thompson is to receive a monthly allowance of $2,000 for living expenses. $2,000. After 30 years of 12-hour nursing shifts, of coming home with aching feet and still making dinner. After saving every penny so our children could have better lives. Sarah actually smiled, reaching over to squeeze Michael's hand in congratulation. Margaret's retirement account will be managed by Sarah Thompson, who has power of attorney for any medical decisions regarding Margaret Thompson should she become incapacitated. "Which could be any day now," Sarah interjected, pulling out a folder. "We've documented numerous instances of confusion, memory loss, and erratic behavior. It's heartbreaking, really, watching her decline." "What are you talking about?" I finally found my voice. though it came out as barely a whisper. Emma finally looked up from her phone. "Mom, you've been forgetting things. Like when you promised me Grandma's emerald necklace last month, then denied it completely." "I never promised you that," I said, my voice stronger now. "That conversation never happened." "See?" Michael said to Mr. Harrison, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "This is exactly what we've been dealing with. She's confused, living in denial. Dad saw it too. It's why he made these changes, to protect her from herself." Mr. Harrison shuffled more papers. "There's also the matter of the life insurance policy. The beneficiary has been changed from Margaret Thompson to be split equally among the 3 children. For funeral expenses and estate management," Sarah explained, "to know one in particular, since Margaret won't be capable of handling such things." I sat in that corner chair, watching my children divide my life like vultures over carrion, and felt something inside me shatter. These were the babies I'd sung to sleep, the children I'd sacrificed everything for, the family I'd built my entire identity around. Robert, the man whose hand I'd held through better and worse, had orchestrated this betrayal from our own home, in the study where I'd brought him coffee every morning. "When do I need to leave the house?" I heard myself ask, my voice hollow and unrecognizable. "We'll give you 30 days, Michael said, finally meeting my eyes. There was no guilt there, no remorse, just cold calculation. "Sarah's already found you a nice apartment, 1-bedroom, senior community, very safe. Minimized, just as Robert's business card had promised." That evening, alone in what had been my home for 30 years, I sat at Robert's desk with his laptop open before me. If they were going to take everything from me, I at least deserved to know the full truth. His email password was still our anniversary date. Even in betrayal, he'd kept that small, sentimental detail. I searched deeper this time, going back through years of messages. What I found made my blood run cold. This wasn't a recent development sparked by concern for my well-being. This had been orchestrated for over 2 years, a careful, methodical plan to systematically strip me of everything. The first email was from Michael to Robert, dated January 2 years ago. "Dad, we need to talk about protecting your assets from Mom's family. If something happens to you, her sister Linda could make claims. We should restructure everything now while you're healthy." Linda, my sister who lived in Florida, whom I saw once a year at Christmas. She'd never asked us for a penny, but Michael had painted her as a threat to justify his scheme. I found a spreadsheet Sarah had created titled Margaret Transition Timeline. It detailed every step. First, convince Robert I was showing signs of dementia. Second, slowly take control of finances. Third, change the will. Fourth, after Robert's death, move me to assisted living. Fifth, sell the house. The final column showed projected profits, $750,000 from the house sale, $500,000 from savings, $300,000 from my retirement account. They'd even calculated the resale value of my mother's jewelry collection. There were emails between Sarah and her brother, the supposed elder law expert. He wasn't a lawyer at all, just a financial advisor who specialized in wealth preservation strategies. He'd provided templates for the fake documentation about my cognitive decline, phrases to use that would hold up legally, increasing confusion, unable to manage complex tasks, requiring supervision for financial decisions. Emma's involvement was perhaps the most painful discovery. She'd been promised my jewelry collection and a $50,000 bonus from the estate for supporting the narrative. Her text messages to Sarah were callous. "Just play along for a few more months. Once Mom's in the home, we're set. I can finally pay off my boutique loans." I discovered Michael's real motivation in a chain of emails with someone named Tony Castellano. Michael owed $200,000 in gambling debts. Tony's messages were threatening. "Your old man's money better come through or we'll be visiting your pretty wife and kids." Michael had promised full payment within 6 months of Robert's death. Sarah wasn't innocent either. She'd been having an affair with her personal trainer, Marcus, for 3 years. Their text messages discussed using her inheritance to start a new life in California. Once the old lady is locked away and Michael gets his share, I'm filing for divorce. We'll have enough to buy that beach house. The scope of it went beyond family. They'd been in contact with Sunset Manor, an assisted living facility known for its flexible admission policies. For the right price, they'd declare me incompetent based on the family's testimony alone. The director, Mrs. Hoffman, had already reserved a room for me, noting in her email, "We can have her admitted within 48 hours of your call. Our staff psychiatrist, Dr. Brennan, will provide any necessary documentation." I found Robert's medical records in a hidden folder. His heart condition had been worsening for months, something he'd hidden from me while attending appointments with Michael. The doctor had recommended immediate surgery, but Robert had declined. In his last email to Michael, sent the day before his heart attack, he wrote, "I can't go through with this anymore. What we're doing to your mother is wrong." Michael's response was chilling. "It's too late to back out now, Dad. Everything's in motion. Think about your grandchildren's future." The grandchildren Michael and Sarah claimed they wanted but had been secretly preventing, waiting until they had my money to fund their separate futures. The future they'd built on the destruction of my present. 2 years of lies, of family dinners where they'd smiled and plotted, of Sunday conversations that were reconnaissance missions. Every "I love you, Mom" had been a lie, every hug a betrayal. I closed the laptop and stumbled to my bedroom, my legs barely supporting me. The house felt like it was spinning, walls closing in, 45 years of memories suddenly tainted and poisonous. I collapsed onto the bed I'd shared with Robert, clutching his pillow that still smelled like his cologne, and the dam finally broke. The sobs came from somewhere deep and primal, a place I didn't know existed inside me. They tore through my chest, raw and gasping, the sound of a woman realizing her entire life had been a lie. I screamed into Robert's pillow until my throat was raw, pounding my fists against the mattress where we'd conceived our children, where he'd held me through miscarriages and grief, where I'd nursed him through pneumonia 5 years ago. Every sacrifice mocked me now. I saw myself at 23, giving up my medical school acceptance letter, telling Robert that being his wife and Michael's mother was enough. I remembered the night shifts, leaving 2-year-old Emma crying for Mommy while I went to work because Robert's business was struggling, and we needed my insurance. The holidays I'd worked, so the younger nurses could be with their families, using the overtime pay for Michael's tutoring and Sarah's wedding. I dragged myself to Emma's old room, untouched since she'd moved out, and stared at the wall of photos. Her first dance recital where I'd hand-sewn her costume because we couldn't afford to buy one. The science fair where we'd stayed up until 3 a.m. building a volcano, my eyes burning from exhaustion after a 12-hour shift. Her high school graduation, where she'd thanked her father for his support but forgotten to mention me. In Michael's room, I found the baseball trophies I'd polished religiously, from the Little League team I'd helped coach because Robert was too busy. I remembered teaching him to drive in the hospital parking lot after midnight shifts, patient and encouraging even when he'd scrape the car against a pole. The acceptance letter to Columbia that we'd celebrated with his favorite chocolate cake, made from scratch despite my arthritis flaring up. I stumbled to the kitchen, where every surface held a ghost. The breakfast nook where I'd helped with homework every night. The stove where I'd cooked thousands of meals, learning each family member's preferences, accommodating Sarah's veganism phase, and Emma's gluten-free year, without complaint. The table where we'd celebrated promotions and mourned losses, where I'd thought we were building something real. The photo albums in the living room were the cruelest torture. Our wedding, both of us so young and hopeful. My mother's funeral, where Robert had held me as I sobbed, promising we'd name our next daughter after her. Michael's wedding, where I'd spent months hand-addressing invitations because Sarah wanted them perfect. Every Christmas card, every birthday party, every family vacation where I'd been the one behind the camera, documenting their lives while erasing my own presence. I found myself in Robert's study again, staring at his chair. How many times had I brought him coffee here? How many nights had I rubbed his shoulders when work stressed him? I trusted him completely, never questioning where money went, never demanding to see statements. Good wives trust their husbands. That's what my mother had taught me, what I'd believed for 45 years. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight, and I realized I'd been crying for hours. My eyes were swollen shut, my body shaking with dehydration and exhaustion. I crawled to the bathroom and saw myself in the mirror. A 68-year-old woman with silver hair I'd stopped dyeing to save money, crow's feet from decades of smiling at patients and family, hands spotted and weathered from years of hard work. You stupid, stupid woman, I whispered to my reflection. You gave them everything, and this is what you're worth. A monthly allowance and a locked room in a facility. I slid to the bathroom floor, pressing my cheek against the cold tile, and wondered if this was what dying felt like. Not from illness, but from the complete annihilation of everything you thought was true. At 3 a.m., something shifted. I was lying on that cold bathroom floor, my tears finally exhausted, when I heard Robert's voice in my memory. Not the Robert who betrayed me, but the young man who'd proposed after I delivered a difficult baby during my nursing rotation. "Margaret," he'd said, "you just saved 2 lives. You're the strongest person I know." I pulled myself up slowly, gripping the sink for support, and looked at my reflection again. But this time, I saw something different. Not a foolish old woman, but a survivor. A nurse who'd performed CPR on dying children, who'd held the hands of patients taking their last breaths, who'd worked 36-hour shifts during the hospital strikes and never complained. I'd faced death hundreds of times in that emergency room. I'd be damned if I'd let my own children bury me while I was still breathing. I walked to the kitchen, made myself the strongest cup of coffee I'd ever brewed, and sat at the table where they'd plotted my destruction. The sunrise was beginning to paint the sky pink and gold through the window, and with it came clarity, sharp as a scalpel. They thought I was weak because I was kind. They mistook my gentleness for stupidity, my love for blindness. But I hadn't survived 30 years in emergency medicine by being weak. I'd made split-second decisions that meant life or death. I'd stayed calm while others panicked. I'd fought death itself and won more times than I'd lost. Michael had his father's arrogance, assuming I'd never check Robert's files. Sarah had underestimated me because I'd played the role of agreeable mother-in-law so well. Emma thought her tears and manipulation would always work on soft-hearted mom. They'd all forgotten who I really was beneath the aprons and the apple pies. I thought about the evidence I'd found, the conspiracy laid out in their own words. They'd been so confident, so careless, leaving a digital trail a mile wide. But they'd also been clever, using legal documents, playing the system. If I was going to fight them, I'd need to be smarter, more strategic. This wasn't about revenge, it was about survival and justice. Standing in my kitchen as the sun rose higher, I made a decision. I wouldn't go quietly into that assisted living facility. I wouldn't accept their monthly allowance like a beggar. I wouldn't let them erase 45 years of my life and contributions. They wanted war? They'd forgotten I'd worked in a war zone every night for 3 decades, battling against death, disease, and despair. I thought about my resources. My friendship with Beth Morrison, who'd retired from the FBI 5 years ago and lived 2 streets over. We'd stayed close since she'd been a frequent visitor to the ER during her field days. She'd always said if I ever needed anything, just call. Well, I needed something now. There was also Dr. Patricia Lawson, the chief psychiatrist at my old hospital. We'd worked together for 20 years. She could easily refute any claims about my supposed cognitive decline. She'd actually complimented my mental acuity just last month when we'd had coffee. And then there was the safety deposit box. Robert had one at First National Bank, registered in both our names. He'd never changed that, probably forgot it existed. We'd put our important documents there years ago. If his original will was anywhere, it would be there. I pulled out a notebook, the same kind I'd used for patient charts, and began writing. Not the wandering thoughts of a confused old woman, but a strategic plan. Documents to gather, people to contact, evidence to secure. They'd spent 2 years planning my destruction. I had less than 30 days to plan their downfall. The Margaret who'd trusted blindly, who'd sacrificed everything for others, who'd stood in the back at her husband's funeral, she was gone. In her place stood someone harder, smarter, and absolutely determined to reclaim her life. They'd awakened something they should have left sleeping. A woman with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The next morning, I called Beth Morrison before the sun was fully up. "I need your help," I said simply when she answered. Within an hour, she was at my kitchen table, her trained investigator's eyes scanning through the printed emails and documents I'd found. Her face grew darker with each page. "Margaret, this is conspiracy to commit elder abuse, fraud, and theft," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "But they've been clever. Everything looks legal on the surface. We need more than emails. We need irrefutable proof." Together, we developed a plan. Beth knew a forensic accountant, Thomas Chen, who specialized in financial elder abuse cases. Within days, he'd uncovered what Michael had hidden, offshore accounts where he'd already started moving money, forged documents with my signature, and most damning, evidence that he'd been slowly poisoning Robert with increased doses of his heart medication to accelerate his death. The prescription refills didn't match Robert's actual needs. Michael had been stockpiling and administering extra doses during his visits. "Your son didn't just plan to steal from you," Thomas said grimly. "He murdered his father." Dr. Patricia Lawson was horrified when I told her about the cognitive decline claims. She immediately wrote a detailed assessment of my mental acuity and pulled my recent test results from my annual physical. "Your cognitive function scores are in the 95th percentile for your age group," she said. "I'll testify to that in court if needed." But the real breakthrough came when I visited the safety deposit box. Inside, along with our original will leaving everything to me, was something I'd never expected. A DVD labeled, "For Margaret, Insurance." My hands shook as I took it to Beth's house to watch on her laptop. Robert's face appeared on the screen, dated 3 years ago. He looked healthy, vibrant. The man I'd married, not the hollow shell he'd become under Michael's influence. "My dearest Margaret," he began, "if you're watching this, something has happened to me, and you need the truth. Michael has been pressuring me to change our will, to cut you out. He claims you're showing signs of dementia, but I know that's a lie. You're sharp as ever. Probably sharper than me." He laughed, that familiar sound I'd loved for decades. "I'm making this recording without Michael's knowledge. Everything we built together is yours, Margaret. You earned it through your sacrifice, your work, your love. I've documented Michael's gambling debts, Sarah's embezzlement from her employer, Emma's drug arrests that I paid to make disappear. It's all in a folder behind this video file. I've also recorded several of Michael's threats when I refused to change the will. He doesn't know about these recordings." The video continued for 20 minutes, Robert detailing every aspect of Michael's scheme, expressing his fear for his life, and most importantly, declaring me of completely sound mind and the sole rightful heir to our estate. He'd even had it notarized by his secretary, who'd witnessed the recording. Beth helped me install tiny cameras throughout the house, perfectly legal since it was still my property for another 3 weeks. We recorded Michael and Sarah discussing their plans, Emma practicing her concerned daughter act for the commitment hearing they'd scheduled without my knowledge. Thomas discovered Sarah had embezzled nearly $100,000 from her employer over 2 years, planning to blame it on me if discovered, claiming I'd had access to her work passwords. Emma's boutique was a front for selling prescription drugs supplied by her connection at a pharmacy. The loans I'd co-signed were actually her covering her trafficking debts. We compiled everything meticulously: financial records, medical documents, video evidence, audio recordings. Beth reached out to her former colleagues at the FBI, particularly the Financial Crimes and Elder Abuse divisions. They were very interested in the interstate fraud aspects and the suspicious circumstances of Robert's death. "We're going to destroy them," Beth said, organizing our evidence files. "But we need to do it publicly, so they can't spin the narrative. The funeral is in 3 days. Are you ready?" I thought about standing in that back row, invisible and dismissed. I've never been more ready for anything in my life. The morning of Robert's funeral arrived gray and drizzling, fitting weather for what was about to unfold. I dressed carefully in my black dress, the one Robert had loved, adding my mother's pearl necklace that Sarah had been eyeing for years. My hands were steady as I applied lipstick, no longer the shaking hands of a victim, but the confident hands that had saved countless lives in the emergency room. Beth had worked through the night with her contacts. FBI agents were positioned outside the church, waiting for my signal. The local news had received an anonymous tip about a major story at the funeral of prominent businessman Robert Thompson. Thomas Chen sat 3 rows from the front, briefcase full of financial documents at his feet. Dr. Lawson was in attendance, having canceled her morning appointments to be there. The church filled quickly. Robert's business associates, golf buddies, and our neighbors of 30 years all filed in, murmuring condolences to Michael, who stood at the entrance playing The Grieving Son perfectly. Sarah wore my grandmother's brooch, the one she'd taken from my jewelry box while I was at the hospital with Robert. Emma dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, though no actual tears fell. When I arrived, Michael intercepted me at the door. "Remember what we discussed, Mom. Back row. This is already hard enough without you making a scene." His grip on my arm was firm, almost painful. "Of course, dear," I replied, my voice meek and obliging. I saw the satisfaction in his eyes. The stupid old woman was playing her part. I took my place in the very last pew, behind everyone, invisible as they'd wanted. Mrs. Patterson from the food pantry sat beside me, patting my hand sympathetically. "This is disgraceful," she whispered, "making you sit back here." I squeezed her hand but said nothing. The service began with the usual prayers and hymns. Michael had spared no expense. The massive flower arrangements, the gold-trimmed programs, the choir he'd hired, all paid for with credit cards he'd taken out in my name without my knowledge, as Thomas had discovered. Another fraud to add to the list: Sarah delivered a Bible reading, her voice catching dramatically at just the right moments. Several of Robert's colleagues spoke about his business acumen and dedication. Emma sang Amazing Grace, her voice wavering with what the audience assumed was grief, but I recognized as nervousness. She kept glancing at Michael, seeking approval. Throughout it all, I sat silent in the back, the forgotten widow, while my children performed their elaborate show of mourning for a man they'd helped kill. The irony wasn't lost on me. They were better actors than they'd ever been children. Father Martinez, who'd married Robert and me 45 years ago, took the podium for the final blessing. His eyes found mine in the back row, and I saw sympathy there. He'd noticed the family dynamics, the way I'd been relegated to the shadows. "Before we conclude," Father Martinez announced, "I'd like to ask if anyone would like to share final words about Robert Thompson." Michael immediately stood, smoothing his Italian suit, the one he'd bought last week with my credit card. He walked to the podium with practiced solemnity, pulling out note cards from his pocket. Sarah beamed at him proudly from the front row, already calculating her share of the inheritance. "My father was a great man," Michael began, his voice carrying across the packed church. "He taught me everything about business, about providing for family, about making tough decisions for the greater good." Father Martinez suddenly raised his hand. "I apologize for interrupting, Michael, but I've just been informed there's something special that needs to be shared first. Mrs. Thompson, Robert's beloved wife, arranged something before his passing." The confusion on Michael's face was genuine this time. He looked back at me, still sitting in the last row, and I gave him the smallest smile. Sarah half stood from her pew, her face pale. Father Martinez gestured to the church's audiovisual team. "Please, everyone, direct your attention to the screen." The large projection screen behind the altar flickered to life. The screen illuminated with Robert's face, vibrant and alive, sitting in his study 3 years ago. The entire church fell silent, a collective intake of breath at seeing the dead man speak. "If you're watching this," Robert's voice filled the sanctuary, clear and strong, "then I'm gone, and someone is trying to steal from my beloved Margaret." Michael lunged toward the AV booth, but FBI agent Harrison stepped into his path. "I'd sit down if I were you, Mr. Thompson." The murmur that rippled through the congregation turned into gasps as 2 more agents positioned themselves at the exits. Robert continued on screen. "My son Michael has been pressuring me to declare my wife incompetent and steal her inheritance. He owes over $200,000 to dangerous people because of his gambling addiction. He's been doctoring my medication, giving me extra doses during his visits. If I die of a heart attack, please investigate my son for murder." Sarah stood abruptly, her face white with panic, but Dr. Lawson was already beside her. "You might want to hear the rest, Mrs. Thompson. It concerns your embezzlement." The video Robert methodically detailed everything. Michael's gambling debts to Tony Castellano, complete with recordings of threatening phone calls. Sarah's theft of $100,000 from her employer, with bank records displayed on screen. Emma's drug dealing through her boutique, with surveillance footage from the pharmacy where she obtained pills illegally. "Every Sunday," Robert's voice continued, "they sat at our table, ate Margaret's food, and plotted to destroy her. They called her weak-minded, confused, demented. Let me be clear. My wife is the sharpest, strongest person I know. She worked 30 years as an emergency room nurse, saving lives while they were spending her money before they'd even stolen it." The screen split, showing security footage from my home over the past week. There was Michael rifling through my documents, pocketing my mother's jewelry. Sarah on the phone with Sunset Manor, laughing about dumping the old bat. Emma practicing her fake tears in my bathroom mirror, rehearsing her testimony for my competency hearing. Then came the audio recordings from Michael's visits to Robert, my son's voice threatening and cold. "Sign the papers, old man, or I'll make sure your last days are very uncomfortable. Mom's going to a home either way. You can make this easy or hard." The congregation was in uproar. Robert's business partners stared at Michael in horror. Mrs. Patterson stood up beside me, her voice carrying, "That's elder abuse. That's murder." But Robert wasn't finished. "I've left my entire estate to Margaret, as it should be. The will Michael had drawn up is fraudulent. He forged my signature. The real will is in our safety deposit box, along with evidence of all their crimes. To my children watching this, you killed me for nothing. You destroyed our family for nothing. And Margaret, my love, I'm sorry I was too weak to stop them while I lived, but I made sure they couldn't hurt you after I died." The screen changed to Thomas Chen's forensic accounting report, showing the offshore accounts, the forged documents, the credit cards Michael had opened in my name. Then came Dr. Lawson's psychiatric evaluation, confirming my complete mental competence, scoring in the top percentiles for my age group. Father Martinez spoke into the stunned silence. "Mrs. Margaret Thompson has been the victim of an elaborate conspiracy by her own children. The FBI is here to arrest Michael and Sarah Thompson for murder, elder abuse, fraud, and conspiracy. Emma Thompson will be charged with drug trafficking." Michael tried to run, but the agents were ready. The handcuffs clicked around his wrists as the entire congregation watched. Sarah collapsed into her pew, sobbing, real tears this time. Emma stood frozen, then looked at me across the church, her voice breaking. "Mom, please, I'm sorry. We never meant—" "You meant to lock me away," I said, standing finally, my voice carrying clear and strong through the church. "You meant to steal everything I worked for. You meant to erase me. You killed your father." Agent Harrison read them their rights as the congregation watched in shocked silence. The news cameras captured everything. The children who'd killed their father for money being led away in handcuffs at his own funeral, while their victim, their mother, stood tall in her black dress, finally visible, finally vindicated. The weeks following the funeral passed in a blur of legal proceedings and revelations. Michael was charged with first-degree murder after the autopsy revealed lethal levels of Robert's heart medication in his system. The prosecution had Robert's video confession, the pharmacy records showing Michael's unauthorized refills and text messages where he'd researched accidental overdose heart medication. He faced life in prison without parole. Sarah's employer pressed charges for the full $100,000 she'd embezzled, plus interest and damages. The FBI added federal wire fraud charges when they discovered she'd been stealing from clients across state lines. Her affair with Marcus became public when he testified against her in exchange for immunity, revealing she'd used stolen funds to buy him a car and rent their secret apartment. Her husband filed for divorce from jail, and she faced 15 to 20 years in federal prison. Emma's boutique was raided, uncovering her connection to a prescription drug ring that stretched across 3 states. Her supplier, desperate to reduce his own sentence, provided detailed records of every transaction. She was looking at 10 years minimum, her dreams of entrepreneurship replaced with the reality of a federal conviction. I sat through every day of their trials, not out of vengeance, but as a witness to justice. When Michael took the stand, trying to claim I really was showing signs of dementia, Thomas Chen systematically destroyed him, with financial records showing my competent management of complex accounts. When Sarah sobbed about being manipulated by Michael, Agent Harrison played recordings of her initiating the conspiracy, calling me that stupid old cow who was too dumb to notice their scheme. The house sold quickly once the news coverage died down. I donated Michael's expected share to a gambling addiction treatment center, making sure they knew it was in memory of Robert Thompson, whose son's gambling addiction cost him his life. Sarah's portion went to her employer to partially compensate for her theft, with the remainder going to a shelter for elder abuse victims. Emma's share funded a scholarship for nursing students from disadvantaged backgrounds, young women who wouldn't have to sacrifice their dreams like I had. I moved to a small cottage by the ocean in Maine, far from the Memphis suburb where I'd spent 45 years building a life that had turned to ashes. The sound of waves replaced the grandfather clock's chiming. My new garden grew wild and free, not manicured like the old one. I adopted a rescue dog, a gentle golden retriever named Hope, who'd also been abandoned by her family. Beth Morrison visited monthly, bringing her dry humor and fierce friendship. Dr. Lawson called weekly, checking in not as a psychiatrist but as a friend. The nurses from my old hospital sent cards, expressing their outrage and support. Mrs. Patterson from the food pantry wrote that they'd named their new senior assistance program after me, helping elderly people escape abusive family situations. On what would have been Robert and my 46th anniversary, I received a letter forwarded from my old address. It was from Michael, written from federal prison. Mom, I know you'll never forgive me, and I don't deserve forgiveness. But I need you to know that Dad fought us until the end. He loved you. We killed him for nothing. The money's gone. Legal fees, restitution. Sarah and I are getting divorced. Emma won't speak to any of us. We destroyed everything for nothing. You were never weak. We were. I burned the letter in my fireplace, watching the words turn to ash like my old life. But from those ashes, I built something new, something entirely mine. At 70 now, I volunteered at the local hospital, teaching young nurses not just medical procedures, but life lessons. Never lose yourself in others' expectations. Never mistake kindness for weakness. Never let anyone minimize your worth. I told my story when asked, not as a victim, but as a survivor. The cottage by the sea wasn't the retirement Robert and I had planned, but it was peaceful. It was free. It was mine. Every morning I walked the beach with Hope, watching the sun rise over the ocean, breathing in the salt air, and remembering that sometimes the greatest gift comes disguised as the worst betrayal. My children had tried to bury me, not knowing I was a seed. They'd set me free. 3 years have passed since that funeral, since the day my children learned that underestimating a woman who spent 30 years fighting death was their greatest mistake. I'm 71 now, sitting on my porch overlooking the Atlantic, hope sleeping at my feet, writing this story for you because I know I'm not alone. I know there's someone reading this who sees their own reflection in my pain. The morning sun paints the ocean gold, the same color as Robert's wedding ring that I finally removed last month. I didn't throw it away. It represents 20 good years before the darkness crept in. Those years were real, even if the end was a lie. I've learned that both things can be true. Robert loved me once, and he betrayed me in the end. My children were my greatest joy, and they became my deepest sorrow. Last week, I received a call from a woman in Texas. She'd seen my story on the news and recognized the signs in her own life. Her daughter-in-law had started suggesting memory care facilities, while her son quietly transferred assets. Because of my story, she got a lawyer, a forensic accountant, and discovered a conspiracy nearly identical to mine. She stopped them before they could destroy her. She called me crying, saying I'd saved her life. That's 27 women now who've reached out, each discovering their families were plotting against them. 27 women who fought back instead of disappearing quietly into assisted living facilities. 27 women who learned that love without respect is just manipulation, wearing a familiar face. I think about the signs I missed, or rather, the signs I chose not to see. The sudden interest in my finances, the constant suggestions that I was tired or confused, the way they'd exchange glances when they thought I wasn't looking, the isolation slowly cutting me off from friends who might have noticed what was happening. These predators, because that's what they were, even if they were my children, they count on our love blinding us to their greed. But here's what I've learned. Family isn't about blood. Family is Mrs. Patterson, who still sends me cards every holiday. It's Beth, who helped me fight when I had no strength left. It's Dr. Lawson, who stood up in court and defended my sanity. It's Hope, who licks my tears on bad days and never asks for anything but love and kibble. The cottage is small, but it's mine. Every morning I make coffee, just for one now, but exactly how I like it. I read books I'd put off for 40 years. I paint terrible seascapes that make me happy. I eat breakfast for dinner when I want. I'm learning Italian through an online program, preparing for that trip to Italy. I'm finally taking next spring, alone, but not lonely, free, not abandoned. Sometimes, standing on the beach at sunset, I think about Margaret the nurse, Margaret the wife, Margaret the mother. Those women died in that courthouse bathroom at 3 a.m. The woman who rose from that floor was someone new, someone who understood that the greatest tragedy isn't being betrayed by those you love, but betraying yourself by accepting less than you deserve. Your kindness is not weakness. Your gentleness is not stupidity. Your love is not an invitation for exploitation. And if someone, anyone, whether they share your blood or your bed, tries to convince you otherwise, remember my story. Remember that a 68-year-old woman brought down a conspiracy of vultures with nothing but determination and the truth. So I ask you, are there people in your life who mistake your kindness for weakness? Who see your love as something to exploit rather than treasure? Are there signs you're choosing not to see because the truth would hurt too much? Don't wait for your own funeral to discover the truth. Don't let them minimize you while you're still breathing. What would you do if you discovered your family was plotting against you? Share your thoughts below. And if my story resonated with you, if it made you think about relationships in your own life, please share it. You might save someone who doesn't yet know they need saving. Like and subscribe if you believe that every person, regardless of age, deserves dignity, respect, and justice. Because somewhere, There's another Margaret who needs to know she's not crazy, she's not alone, and she's definitely not weak. Remember, they can only bury you if you agree to lie down.